The sanctuary doors burst open with a thunderous crash that silenced the choir mid-hymn. 3 police officers stormed down the center aisle, their heavy boots echoing against marble floors as 200 pairs of eyes turned in horror. Behind them, Karen Whitmore pointed directly at the Johnson family, her face twisted with righteous fury. "That's them!" she hissed, her voice carrying across the stunned congregation. "They don't belong here!" Marcus Johnson felt his 8-year-old daughter Zoe shrink against his side as Officer Bradley approached their pew. The little girl's Sunday dress, carefully pressed that morning, seemed to crumple under the weight of every stare. His wife Sarah reached across him, pulling their son David closer, her hand trembling as she smoothed his tie. "Sir, we need you to come with us," Bradley said, his hand resting on his belt. "There's been a complaint." The morning had started with such promise. Marcus remembered waking early, excitement bubbling in his chest as he prepared for their first Sunday at Grace Community Church. After 3 months in Millbrook, they'd finally found a congregation that felt right. The pastor's sermons online had spoken to his soul, and Sarah had been drawn to their community outreach programs. "What kind of complaint?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. He'd learned long ago to remain calm in situations like this, though he'd never imagined facing one in God's house. Karen stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. At 52, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to having her way. Her platinum hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her pearl necklace caught the light streaming through stained glass windows. "They're trespassing," she declared, loud enough for the entire sanctuary to hear. "This is a private church for our community members." Pastor Williams rose from his seat behind the pulpit, his weathered face creased with confusion and growing anger. At 68, he'd served Grace Community for 37 years, baptizing children and burying grandparents, officiating weddings and counseling the troubled. Never once had he witnessed such a disruption during worship. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his deep voice booming across the sanctuary. "This is God's house, and everyone is welcome here." But Karen had already captured the officer's attention. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be photographs. "I have evidence of suspicious behavior. They were taking pictures of our building yesterday, casing the place. Then they show up today acting like they belong." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She remembered taking those photos, snapping pictures of the beautiful architecture to send to her mother back in Atlanta. The Gothic spires and intricate stonework had reminded her of the churches of her childhood, and she'd wanted to share their joy at finding such a beautiful place of worship. "Those were pictures for my family," Sarah whispered, but her voice was lost in the growing murmur of the congregation. Officer Bradley looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the family and Karen. "Ma'am, taking photographs isn't a crime." "It is when they're planning something," Karen snapped. "Do you see how they're dressed? They're trying too hard to fit in. Real church members don't need to prove themselves." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He looked down at his navy suit, the one he'd bought specifically for job interviews when they'd moved to Millbrook. Sarah wore her favorite burgundy dress, the one that made her feel confident and beautiful. Their children were dressed in their Sunday best, just as his grandmother had taught him years ago. Zoe tugged on his sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy, why is that lady mad at us?" Before Marcus could answer, David stood up, his 12-year-old frame trembling with indignation. "We didn't do anything wrong. We just came to church like everyone else." "Sit down, boy," Officer Stevens barked, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The gesture sent a chill through the sanctuary. Several congregants gasped, and Marcus felt his protective instincts surge. He placed a firm hand on David's shoulder, gently but firmly guiding him back to his seat. "Please," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of every indignity he'd ever faced. "We're just trying to worship. We've done nothing wrong." Pastor Williams stepped down from the pulpit, his movements deliberate and measured. "Officers, I'm the pastor of this church, and I'm telling you that this family is welcome here. They attended our Wednesday night service this week and were nothing but respectful and engaged." Karen's face flushed with anger. "Pastor Williams, with all due respect, you don't understand the kind of people we're dealing with. They move into our neighborhoods, take over our spaces, and before you know it, everything changes." The ugly truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Several congregants shifted uncomfortably in their pews, while others nodded in apparent agreement. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin. Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. She'd grown up in the South, where racism often wore a more obvious face. But this northern variety, dressed up in concern for property values and community standards, felt somehow more insidious. "I think it's best if you all just come with us," Officer Bradley said, his tone suggesting the decision had already been made. "We can sort this out at the station." "Sort what out?" Pastor Williams demanded, his voice rising. "What law have they broken? What crime have they committed other than being black in a white church?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Several congregants gasped, and Karen's mouth fell open in shock. But Pastor Williams continued, his years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "I've watched this congregation shrink year after year as we've become more concerned with comfort than with Christ's message. We talk about loving our neighbors, but panic when they actually show up." Elder Thompson, a distinguished man in his 70s who'd served on the church board for decades, slowly rose from his seat in the front pew. His silver hair caught the morning light as he turned to face the congregation. "Pastor Williams is right," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "I've been a member of this church for 43 years, and I've never been more ashamed." Karen spun around, her face a mask of disbelief. "Richard, you can't be serious. You know what happens when they start coming. Property values drop, crime goes up, and before you know it, it's not our community anymore." "Our community," Elder Thompson's voice rose with each word. "Last time I checked, this was God's community, and He doesn't have a preference for skin color." Young Zoe, who'd been silent since the ordeal began, suddenly stood up on the pew seat. Her clear, sweet voice carried across the sanctuary as she began to sing "Jesus Loves Me," the same song she'd learned in vacation Bible school at their old church in Atlanta. The simple melody seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. Several children in the congregation joined in, their innocent voices creating a harmony that spoke to something deeper than the hatred poisoning the adult world around them. Officer Bradley looked increasingly uncomfortable. He'd joined the force to serve and protect, not to remove families from churches. "Look, maybe we can all just calm down and work this out." But Karen wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone again, this time opening what appeared to be a group chat. "I'm calling the board of directors. They need to know what's happening here." Marcus watched as she typed furiously, her manicured nails clicking against the screen. He could only imagine the messages she was sending, the narrative she was crafting to justify what was happening. Sarah leaned close to his ear. "Maybe we should just go," she whispered. This isn't worth putting the children through. But something in Marcus rebelled against the suggestion. How many times had his people been told to just go, to find somewhere else, to not make trouble? How many dreams had been deferred in the name of keeping the peace? "No," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "We came here to worship God, and that's what we're going to do." He stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame commanding attention. "Officers, I'm a software engineer at Morrison Tech. My wife is a pediatric nurse at Millbrook General. Our children are honor roll students at Maple Elementary and Lincoln Middle School. We pay our taxes, vote in every election, and volunteer at the food bank." His voice grew stronger with each word. "We're not criminals. We're not troublemakers. We're Christians who came to church to worship God alongside our neighbors." The sanctuary fell silent, except for the sound of Zoe's continued humming. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, causing Officer Stevens to tense, but he only pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is the email Pastor Williams sent us on Wednesday, welcoming us to the congregation and inviting us to today's service. Would you like to read it?" Pastor Williams stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I sent that email because I was moved by their faith and their questions about our community ministry. In 37 years of pastoring, I've rarely met a family more committed to Christian service." Karen's phone buzzed, and her face lit up with triumph. "The board is on their way. They'll straighten this out." But her satisfaction was short-lived. Elder Thompson was already making phone calls of his own, and within minutes, other board members began arriving. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the church's longest-serving board member, entered through the side door, her expression grim. At 75, Dr. Hayes commanded respect, not just for her age, but for her decades of service to the community. As the first female physician in Millbrook and a civil rights activist in her youth, she'd fought battles that younger generations could barely imagine. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded, her steely gaze taking in the scene before her. Karen rushed forward, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "Dr. Hayes, thank goodness you're here. These people showed up claiming to be members, but they're not in our directory. They were taking pictures yesterday, acting suspicious. And when I tried to verify their membership..." "You called the police on a family attending Sunday service. Dr." Hayes's voice could have frozen fire. "Karen, what has gotten into you?" More board members arrived, creating a crowd near the altar. Marcus noticed that several seemed genuinely distressed by what they were witnessing, while others appeared to share Karen's concerns. Board member Janet Morrison, whose family had donated the stained glass windows, looked visibly shaken. Pastor Williams, surely there was a better way to handle this situation. "Handle what situation?" Pastor Williams shot back. "A family coming to church. Since when is that a situation that needs handling?" The congregation was becoming increasingly divided. Some members had begun leaving, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others moved closer, unwilling to miss whatever was about to unfold. Officer Bradley's radio crackled to life. "Unit 23, what's your status?" He glanced around the sanctuary, taking in the growing crowd of church leaders, the family at the center of the controversy, and the increasingly agitated congregation. "Dispatch, we have a civil dispute at Grace Community Church. No immediate threat, but tensions are high." "Copy that. Do you need backup?" Before Bradley could respond, Dr. Hayes stepped forward. "Officer, I'm Dr. Patricia Hayes, chairman of this church's board of directors. I want to be very clear, this family is welcome in our church. They are our guests. And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. Karen's face went white. Patricia, you don't understand. We have standards, procedures. Standards. Dr. Hayes's voice rose to fill the sanctuary. What standards? The standard that says we judge people by the color of their skin, rather than the content of their character. The standard that says God's house has a members-only policy. She turned to address the entire congregation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting for justice. I helped integrate this town's hospitals in 1967. I marched with Dr. King in Washington. I thought we'd moved beyond this ugliness. But apparently, some of us haven't. Young David Johnson, who'd been silent since the officer's threat, suddenly spoke up. My grandmother marched too. She told me about it before she died. She said the hardest part wasn't the police or the dogs or the fire hoses. It was the good people who did nothing. His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the sanctuary like a heavy blanket. Several congregants looked down at their hands, shame written across their faces. Elder Thompson moved to stand beside the Johnson family. This family has done nothing wrong. They came to worship God, just like the rest of us. If we turn them away, we might as well lock these doors forever. More congregants began to move, some heading for the exits, but others stepping forward to show their support. Mrs. Chen, whose family had faced their own struggles as Asian immigrants, walked over to sit in the pew behind the Johnsons. My family knows what it's like to be unwelcome, she said quietly. This church welcomed us 20 years ago when others wouldn't. Today, I stand with this family. The gesture seemed to break something loose in the sanctuary. Other families began moving forward, creating a protective circle around the Johnsons. Not everyone joined them, but enough did to make a statement. Karen looked around in dismay, realizing she was losing the support she'd counted on. This is ridiculous. We have procedures for membership. You can't just let anyone walk in off the street. Why not? Asked a voice from the back of the sanctuary. Everyone turned to see Emma Rodriguez, the church's youth pastor, walking down the aisle. At 28, she represented the younger generation that many hoped would lead the church into the future. Jesus didn't check membership rolls. Emma continued, her voice strong and clear. He welcomed tax collectors and prostitutes, Samaritans and Romans. Are we really going to be more exclusive than Christ himself? Pastor Williams found his voice again, stepping back up to the pulpit. Emma's right. We've lost our way if we're more concerned with who belongs than with belonging to God. He opened his Bible, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Let me read something from Matthew 25. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Not, I was a stranger, and you called the police. Officer Bradley finally spoke up. Look, from where I stand, no crime has been committed here. This is a church matter, not a police matter. Unless someone wants to press charges for trespassing, and it sounds like the church leadership doesn't, we're done here. Karen spun around, desperation creeping into her voice. They could be dangerous. We don't know anything about them. We know they came to church, Dr. Hayes said flatly. We know they brought their children. We know they've been respectful and engaged. What more do we need to know? The officers began moving toward the exit, clearly ready to leave this civil dispute behind. But Karen wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone again, this time opening what appeared to be a social media app. Fine, she said, her voice taking on a threatening tone. If the church won't protect our community, I'll make sure everyone knows what's happening here. She began recording a video, her voice taking on the breathless tone of someone reporting breaking news. "This is Karen Whitmore, and I'm standing in Grace Community Church, where the leadership has decided to prioritize political correctness over community safety." Dr. Hayes stepped directly into the camera's frame. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Patricia Hayes, and I've been a member of this church longer than you've been alive. What you're witnessing isn't political correctness. It's Christianity." The confrontation was drawing a crowd of phone cameras as other congregants began recording their own versions of events. In the age of social media, the incident was already spinning beyond the walls of the sanctuary. Marcus felt Sarah squeeze his hand as they watched their private moment of crisis become a public spectacle. But something had shifted in the room. The fear and confusion of the morning was giving way to something else: determination, perhaps, or simple human decency asserting itself. Pastor Williams raised his hand for attention. "Brothers and sisters, we have a choice to make today. We can let fear and prejudice drive our decisions, or we can remember why we're here." He looked directly at the Johnson family. "Marcus, Sarah, David, Zoe, I want to formally apologize for what you've experienced today. This is not who we aspire to be." Then he turned to Karen. "And Karen, I want you to know that you're welcome here too. But your actions today have damaged our community and hurt innocent people. That requires accountability." Karen's face flushed red. "Don't you dare lecture me about accountability. I've given more to this church than most people here. I organized the fall festival. I coordinated the food drives. You called the police on a family coming to worship." Dr. Hayes interrupted. "Whatever good you've done doesn't erase the harm you've caused today." The board members huddled together in quiet conversation, their voices too low to hear, but their expressions serious. Finally, Dr. Hayes stepped forward to address the congregation. "As chairman of the board, I'm calling an emergency meeting for this afternoon. We need to address what happened here today and make sure it never happens again." She turned to Karen. "Your actions have violated not just the spirit of Christian fellowship, but also our church's stated values of inclusion and welcome. There will be consequences." Karen's composure finally cracked. "You can't do this to me. I've been a member here for 15 years. I've given thousands of dollars, volunteered countless hours. And we're grateful for your service," Pastor Williams said gently. "But service doesn't give anyone the right to harm others or to decide who belongs in God's house." The sanctuary had grown quieter as people processed what they'd witnessed. Some congregants had left, unwilling to be part of the confrontation. Others remained, seemingly transfixed by the drama unfolding before them. Zoe, who'd been remarkably patient throughout the ordeal, tugged on her father's sleeve again. "Daddy, can we sing now? The pretty windows make me want to sing." Her innocent request seemed to remind everyone why they'd come together in the first place. Pastor Williams smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed all morning. "Zoe, would you like to choose a song for us?" Without hesitation, she pointed to the hymnal in the pew rack. "Amazing Grace. Grandma always said it was the most important song." Pastor Williams nodded to the organist, who'd been sitting frozen at her bench throughout the confrontation. Slowly, the familiar melody began to fill the sanctuary. Marcus felt tears in his eyes as voices around them joined in the ancient hymn. Not everyone sang. Some pews remained conspicuously silent, but enough did to create a sound that seemed to wash away some of the morning's ugliness. When the song ended, Dr. Hayes announced that the regular service would continue. "We've allowed fear and hatred to disrupt our worship long enough. Pastor Williams, please continue with your sermon." But Pastor Williams looked at his prepared notes and shook his head. "I think we've heard the sermon we needed to hear today. Sometimes God speaks through children and through the courage of strangers." He closed his Bible and stepped down from the pulpit. "Let us pray, not just for forgiveness, but for the strength to do better." As heads bowed around the sanctuary, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected to feel after such a morning hope. Not everyone had stood with them, but enough had. Not everyone had chosen courage, but some had. After the service, small groups clustered throughout the sanctuary and spilled out into the parking lot. The Johnson family found themselves surrounded by church members offering apologies, support, and invitations to lunch. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd been silent during the confrontation, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have said something sooner. I was scared. But that's no excuse." Sarah hugged her gently. "Fear is understandable. What matters is what we do with it." "Doctor," Hayes pulled Marcus aside as the crowd began to thin. "I want you to know that the board will be taking action. Karen's behavior today was unacceptable, and there will be consequences." Marcus nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. "Dr. Hayes, I appreciate that. But punishment isn't what we're after. We just want to worship in peace." "I understand," she replied. "But sometimes consequences are necessary to protect others and to make clear what a community stands for." The emergency board meeting that afternoon was tense but decisive. Karen was formally censured and removed from all leadership positions. More importantly, the board voted to implement new policies around inclusion and to require anti-bias training for all volunteer leaders. The incident didn't end there. Karen's social media posts had gone viral, but not in the way she'd intended. The video footage of the confrontation, taken from multiple angles, painted a clear picture of what had transpired. Public reaction was swift and largely negative. By Monday morning, local news stations were calling. By Tuesday, the story had reached national outlets. Grace Community Church found itself at the center of a conversation about racism in religious institutions. Pastor Williams, thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight, tried to focus on positive change. "This incident has forced us to examine ourselves," he told reporters. "That's painful, but necessary work." The Johnsons, for their part, decided to continue attending Grace Community Church. "Running away won't solve anything," Marcus explained to a reporter. "Change happens when people stay and do the hard work of building bridges." Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The controversy had driven some members away, but it attracted others. Families from different backgrounds began visiting, curious about a church that had publicly confronted its own prejudices. The congregation grew more diverse, and with that diversity came new energy and perspectives. The children's choir, which had been struggling with declining membership, suddenly had a waiting list. The community outreach programs expanded to serve neighborhoods that had previously been overlooked. Karen, meanwhile, faced consequences beyond the church. The video of her confrontation with the Johnson family had cost her job at a local real estate firm. Her social media presence, once devoted to community organizing, had been overwhelmed by criticism. She'd largely withdrawn from public life, but 3 months after the incident, she did something unexpected. She showed up at the church's Wednesday evening service. Pastor Williams noticed her sitting in the back row, looking smaller somehow than she had that Sunday morning. After the service, she approached him privately. "Pastor, I need to talk to someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lost everything, and I'm starting to think I deserve to." It was the beginning of a long conversation about hurt and healing, about the fear that drives hatred and the grace that can overcome it. Pastor Williams had seen it before, the moment when someone's world crumbles enough for light to get in. The process wasn't quick or easy. It involved acknowledging harm done, making amends where possible, and doing the hard work of examining long-held beliefs and assumptions. 6 months after that Sunday morning confrontation, Grace Community Church held a special service celebrating its growing diversity. The sanctuary was fuller than it had been in years, with faces representing many different backgrounds and experiences. Pastor Williams looked out over the congregation as Zoe Johnson, now a regular member of the children's choir, led the opening song. Her clear voice soared above the others, carrying a message of hope that had been tested but not broken. In the third row, Marcus and Sarah Johnson sat with their children, no longer visitors, but integral members of a community that had chosen growth over comfort. Behind them sat Mrs. Chen and her family, along with other families who had found courage in the Johnsons' example. And in the back row, still working through her own journey of understanding, sat Karen Whitmore. She didn't sing along, not yet, but she listened. And sometimes listening is the first step toward harmony. Dr. Hayes, now 86 and still sharp as ever, delivered the final blessing. "We gather as God's people, imperfect but striving, broken but healing, divided but working toward unity. May we continue to choose love over fear, welcome over exclusion, and grace over judgment." As the congregation filed out into the bright afternoon, children of different colors played together in the parking lot while their parents made plans for the week ahead. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress, the kind that happens one conversation, one choice, one Sunday at a time. The stained glass windows caught the late sunlight, casting rainbow patterns across the empty pews. In the silence that followed worship, the sanctuary held the echoes of voices raised together, a harmony built not from uniformity, but from the beautiful complexity of human difference, united in common purpose. Grace Community Church had faced a moment of crisis and chosen to become something better. The work continued, as it always would, but the foundation had been strengthened by the storms it had weathered. And in a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding, that was a victory worth celebrating.